Teen exposes corrupt politician, but when he threatens her family, she uncovers a web of lies and deceit that forces her into a crazy situation. Samantha's heart pounded as she stared at the papers spread across the dining room table. The usual bustle of her family's evening routine faded into the background as the weight of what she had just uncovered settled in. The emails and bank statements weren't just incriminating, they were explosive. As the faint hum of the television in the living room droned on, Samantha's mind raced. Could this really be happening? She had always known Gregory Thorne as the charming mayor who handed out trophies at school events. But these documents painted a very different picture. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead as she flipped through the pages again, making sure she wasn't imagining things. The evidence was undeniable. Transfers of large sums of money to offshore accounts, suspicious payments labeled as consulting fees, and emails that all but confirmed the involvement of local gangsters in Thorne's operations. This wasn't just a case of a politician lining his pockets. It was a web of deceit that threatened the very fabric of her community. Samantha's fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone, instinctively reaching for her best friend, Emily. But halfway through dialing, she hesitated and set the phone down. This was bigger than gossiping over the latest drama at school. Samantha knew she couldn't just sit on this information, but the more she thought about what to do next, the more daunting it all seemed. She imagined her mother's face, stern but supportive, reminding her of the importance of doing the right thing. Yet she also knew her mother would never forgive herself if this cost her job, or worse, if it put their family in danger. Samantha bit her lip, trying to weigh her options. Could she trust the police? The media? The risks were enormous. She needed to be smart, and more than that, she needed to be careful. She decided the first step was to make sure she understood everything. After all, this wasn't a TV show where the bad guys got caught in a neat 45-minute episode. Samantha spent the next few hours hunched over the documents, cross-referencing names, dates, and figures. It was late and the house had gone quiet. Her mother had long since gone to bed, leaving Samantha alone with the faint glow of the kitchen light. Every so often, the old refrigerator would click and hum, making her jump. Despite her nerves, she felt a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. She was on the verge of something big, something that could change everything. By the time she had gathered all the information she needed, Samantha was exhausted but resolute. She couldn't risk using her home computer, so she made her way to the small library in town the next day. It was a quiet place, a relic of a bygone era, where the scent of old books mingled with the dusty air. The librarian, an elderly woman with kind eyes, barely looked up as Samantha slipped into one of the back rooms. There, under the guise of working on a summer project, Samantha began setting up a new email account and browsing forums for advice on whistleblowing. She found herself navigating through layers of encryption and anonymity she never knew existed. It was like peeling back the layers of a mystery novel, only this time, she was in it. The more she read, the more the gravity of her situation hit her. This wasn't just a school project. This was real life, with real consequences. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was doing the right thing. As she clicked through page after page, she noticed the clock ticking down the minutes. Each second brought her closer to a decision she couldn't take back. Finally, with a deep breath, she sent an anonymous tip to a prominent investigative journalist known for taking down corrupt officials. It was a small step, but it was the first step in what she knew would be a dangerous journey. As Samantha left the library, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town. The familiar streets suddenly felt different, charged with a new energy. She could almost feel the weight of the secret she carried pressing down on her. But at the same time, a spark of defiance lit up inside her. Gregory Thorne had no idea what was coming, and that thought alone kept her going. Samantha knew she was stepping into a storm, but she was determined not to let it sweep her away. Samantha sat in the small, cluttered room that Eric called his lair, a space that smelled faintly of old pizza and energy drinks. The walls were plastered with posters of video game characters, and a string of multicolored lights blinked lazily above the dual monitors on his desk. Eric, a lanky 17-year-old with unruly hair and a penchant for black hoodies, was hunched over his keyboard, typing furiously. His room was always a bit of a sensory overload, but today the chaos seemed comforting, like a protective bubble shielding them from the dangers lurking outside. "Okay, Sam, we're in," Eric said, spinning around in his chair with a triumphant grin. "I've set up the blog on a secure server. It's completely anonymous. No way anyone can trace it back to us." Samantha felt a brief wave of relief wash over her, but it was quickly replaced by a gnawing anxiety. She watched Eric's face, so confident and sure, and wished she could share his certainty. "Are you sure this will work?" she asked, her voice betraying the nervousness she was trying to hide. Eric nodded, his expression softening as he saw the worry etched on her face. "It'll work. We just have to be careful and smart about how we do this." They huddled closer together as Eric began explaining the plan in detail. The blog, he said, would act like a puzzle for the public to solve. They would release small pieces of evidence gradually, enough to raise suspicions but not enough to reveal everything at once. "We'll start with the less explosive stuff," Eric suggested, pulling up a document on the screen. "Emails that hint at shady dealings. But don't directly accuse Thorne of anything major. It'll get people talking without setting off alarm bells right away." Samantha nodded, feeling a mix of dread and determination. The thought of Thorne's eventual downfall was the only thing keeping her from spiraling into panic. As they sifted through the documents, selecting the first batch to release, Samantha couldn't shake the image of Thorne's smug face from her mind. He was the kind of politician who knew how to play people, his smile never quite reaching his eyes. She had seen him at town events, surrounded by adoring crowds, and she now realized how deep his deception ran. The man who shook hands with her mother at a charity gala was the same man who funneled money to criminals, exploiting the very people who trusted him. Samantha clenched her fists at the thought, her resolve hardening. Thorne had to be stopped, no matter the cost. "Hey, you still with me?" Eric's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. He was watching her with concern, his hand hovering over the keyboard. Samantha blinked, realizing she had been lost in her own head for who knows how long. "Yeah, sorry, just thinking about how much is riding on this," she said, forcing a small smile. Eric reached out, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "We're in this together, Sam. And once we start dropping these files, Thorne's days are numbered." Samantha nodded again, trying to absorb some of Eric's confidence. But deep down, the fear gnawed at her. Fear not just for herself, but for her family and the friends who might get caught in the crossfire. They spent the next few hours working out the final details. Eric showed her how to update the blog, how to schedule posts, and how to monitor traffic without leaving any digital footprints. It was like preparing for a high-stakes game, and Samantha was acutely aware that there were no second chances. Every click, every post would have consequences. She kept reminding herself that this was for the greater good, that exposing Thorne would ultimately protect more people than it would endanger. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach from growing. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Eric's room, they finally decided to go live. The first post was a simple introduction, anonymous of course, explaining that the blog was dedicated to uncovering the truth behind local corruption. "We need a name," Eric said suddenly, his fingers hovering over the publish button. They tossed around a few ideas before settling on Clearwater Expose. It was subtle but pointed, a nod to their town, and a declaration of their intent to cleanse it of Thorne's poison. With one final deep breath, Samantha gave Eric a nod. He clicked publish, and the blog was live. For a moment, they just stared at the screen, the weight of what they had done settling over them like a heavy blanket. There was no turning back now. Samantha's heart raced as she thought about what would happen next. Would anyone notice? Would Thorne find out? The unknowns were terrifying, but the thought of doing nothing was even worse. As they packed up for the night, the air was thick with a mix of excitement and fear. They had taken the first step, but the road ahead was uncertain and full of danger. Samantha glanced at Eric, who gave her a small, reassuring smile. They were in this together, and they would face whatever came next as a team. Samantha stared at her phone, watching the number of views on the blog climb higher and higher. Every refresh brought a fresh surge of adrenaline and fear. What had started as a trickle of curiosity had become a flood of interest, with people all over town sharing the link, commenting, and speculating. The first post had hit harder than she expected, drawing attention not just from concerned citizens, but also from local reporters and activists. She could see the tension spreading through her community, like a tightly wound spring ready to snap. As exhilarating as it was to see the truth coming out, the looming consequences felt like a dark cloud over her head. At school, whispers filled the hallways as students checked their phones, debating the latest updates. Samantha kept her head down, pretending not to notice as her classmates buzzed with excitement and outrage. Eric tried to keep things normal, cracking jokes and acting casual, but she could see the worry in his eyes every time he glanced at her. "You okay?" he asked as they walked to their next class. Samantha forced a smile, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," she replied, hoping her voice didn't betray her nerves. It was one thing to publish the blog. It was another to live with the fear that every conversation, every look, could be the start of her undoing. Meanwhile, Thorne was losing his cool. In the privacy of his office, far from the public eye, he raged at his staff, his voice echoing off the polished wood paneling. "How the hell did this happen?" he bellowed, slamming his fist on his desk. The documents were supposed to be secure, hidden away where no one could find them. Yet here they were, laid bare for the entire town to see. His aides exchanged nervous glances, unsure how to calm their boss. Thorne's carefully crafted image was under attack, and he knew that if he didn't act quickly, his political career could unravel. He needed to find out who was behind the leak, and he needed to find them fast. Samantha's parents had started to notice the change in her. She was more withdrawn, more secretive than usual, and it worried them. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, her mother gave her a long, searching look. "Sam, is everything okay? You've been acting different lately," she asked, her voice gentle but probing. Samantha's stomach twisted as she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm fine, Mom. Just a lot of schoolwork and college applications, you know?" She lied, hoping it sounded convincing. Her mother didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded, choosing to let it go for now. Samantha breathed a quiet sigh of relief, knowing how close she had come to slipping. Thorne's private investigator, a grizzled man with years of experience in the murky world of corporate espionage, was already on the trail. He sat in a dimly lit office, poring over computer screens filled with code and digital footprints. The blog was anonymous, but there were always traces, tiny breadcrumbs that even the most careful could leave behind. He had already narrowed down the possible suspects to a handful of tech-savvy locals, but one name kept rising to the top of his list. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers together thoughtfully. It wouldn't be long now before he had enough evidence to make his move. As the days went by, Samantha found it harder to keep up the facade. The weight of what she had done hung over her like a leaden blanket, making it difficult to concentrate on anything else. Every time her phone buzzed with a notification, her heart skipped a beat, wondering if it was Thorne or his allies finally catching up to her. The pressure was mounting, and she knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. She confided in Eric, her voice barely above a whisper, as they sat in the school library, hidden behind a row of dusty books. "I'm scared, Eric. What if they find out it's us?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eric put on a brave face, but she could see the fear mirrored in his eyes. "We've come this far, Sam. We just have to keep our heads down and be careful." The blog continued to draw attention, with more and more people demanding answers from Thorne. The mayor was still putting on a brave front, dismissing the accusations as baseless rumors. But the cracks were beginning to show. The media was starting to dig, and public opinion was turning against him. But behind the scenes, Thorne was working frantically to silence the whistleblower. His private investigator was getting closer every day, his methods ruthless and efficient. Samantha had no idea just how much danger she was in. But the clock was ticking, and it was only a matter of time before the truth caught up with her. Samantha's hands trembled as she stared at the message on her phone. The words were blunt, threatening. "Stop the blog, or there will be consequences." At first, she tried to convince herself it was just a cruel prank. Maybe someone from school had figured out what she was doing and decided to mess with her. But the knot of fear in her stomach refused to loosen. She knew this wasn't just a joke. Whoever sent the message knew something, and they weren't playing around. The thought of Thorne or one of his allies being behind it sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her heart pounded as she read the message again, her mind racing with possibilities. Later that evening, Samantha was trying to focus on homework, but the words on the page blurred as her anxiety took hold. Her phone buzzed again, and her heart skipped a beat. Reluctantly, she picked it up, dreading what she might see. The new message was worse than she could have imagined. It was a picture of her younger brother Ethan walking home from school, oblivious to the danger shadowing him. The image was sharp, taken up close, and the implication was terrifyingly clear. Her breath caught in her throat as she clutched the phone, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and panic. This wasn't just about her anymore. Thorne had found a way to hurt her where it would hurt the most. Desperate and scared, Samantha knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. She hurried to Eric's house, her mind racing with 1,000 questions. How had they been found out? Had they made a mistake? As soon as Eric opened the door, he saw the fear in her eyes. "Sam, what's going on?" he asked, his voice tense with concern. She thrust the phone into his hands, unable to form the words. Eric's face paled as he looked at the message, the severity of their situation sinking in. "This isn't just a warning," Samantha whispered, her voice trembling. "They know about us, Eric. They know about Ethan." Eric ran a hand through his hair, trying to stay calm, but the fear in his eyes mirrored Samantha's. "We're in deep now," he said quietly, his mind already working through their options. "But if we back down, they'll know they can control us. And Thorne, he'll just keep getting away with it." Samantha nodded, though fear gripped her heart like a vice. She knew Eric was right, but the thought of putting her family in more danger was almost too much to bear. She sank into a chair, her mind spinning. "We have to do something, Eric. But what if they hurt him? What if—" Eric crouched in front of her, his voice firm but gentle. "We'll protect him, Sam. We'll protect everyone. But we can't let Thorne win. We have to keep going. Make sure people see the truth." His words were meant to reassure, but the fear didn't leave Samantha's eyes. She wanted to believe they could handle this, that they were smart enough, strong enough to take on someone as powerful as Thorne. But the stakes had just gotten a lot higher, and the safety of her family was now hanging in the balance. The next day at school, Samantha felt like she was being watched. Every glance, every passing student made her heart race, her paranoia feeding on itself. Was it the kid in the hoodie by the lockers? The teacher who seemed to linger in the hallway? It was probably just her imagination. But she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was keeping tabs on her every move. She stuck close to Eric, her nerves on edge, the picture of Ethan still fresh in her mind. Eric, sensing her anxiety, tried to keep the conversation light, but the tension between them was palpable. Every laugh, every smile felt forced, as if they were playing a part in a show they desperately wanted to end. Despite their fear, they both knew what had to be done. That afternoon, back in Eric's cluttered room, they worked in silence, the weight of their decision heavy in the air. The new batch of evidence was damning, financial records showing clear links between Thorne and the criminal underworld. As they prepared to release the next post, Samantha's hands hovered over the keyboard, hesitation creeping in. "Are we really doing this?" she asked, her voice small and uncertain. Eric didn't hesitate, placing his hand over hers. "We are. We have to," he said, his tone steady. With a deep breath, Samantha clicked the button, sending the new post out into the world. As the screen refreshed, showing the blog updated with the new information, a sense of dread settled over them both. There was no turning back now. They had drawn a line in the sand, and Thorne would undoubtedly come after them with everything he had. But for now, all they could do was wait, hoping that the truth would be enough to keep them safe. Samantha's thoughts drifted back to Ethan, and she made a silent promise to herself. No matter what happened, she would protect him. The fight wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore, it was about survival, and she was determined to see it through to the end. Samantha sat in the back corner of Ms. Carter's classroom, her usual seat during study hall. The room was quiet, the only sound the soft scratch of pencils and the occasional whisper between students. Ms. Carter, a woman in her early 40s with warm brown eyes and a calm demeanor, was grading papers at her desk. Samantha's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the right moment to approach her teacher. She had always admired Ms. Carter, who was known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce dedication to her students. If there was anyone she could trust, it was her. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Samantha hesitated for a moment before finally standing up and walking over to Ms. Carter's desk. "Ms. Carter, can I talk to you about something important?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The teacher looked up, immediately noticing the anxiety in Samantha's eyes. "Of course, Samantha," she replied, setting down her pen and giving her full attention. "Let's go to my office. We can talk there." They made their way down the hall to Ms. Carter's small office, tucked away at the end of the corridor. The room was cozy, with bookshelves lining the walls and a couple of framed photographs on her desk, one of her holding a journalism award and another of her with a group of students on a field trip. Samantha sat down in one of the chairs, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Ms. Carter closed the door behind them and took a seat opposite Samantha, her expression serious but kind. "What's on your mind?" she asked, her tone gentle. Taking a deep breath, Samantha began to explain everything: the blog, the evidence against Thorne, and the terrifying threats she had received. As she spoke, she watched Ms. Carter's face shift from curiosity to shock, and finally to a grim understanding. "My God, Samantha," Ms. Carter murmured when she finished, leaning back in her chair. "You've gotten yourself into something very dangerous. But you've also done something incredibly brave." Samantha felt a mix of relief and fear at her teacher's words, glad to be believed, but terrified of what would happen next. Ms. Carter leaned forward, her voice low and urgent. "The first thing we need to do is make sure you're safe. Have you told your parents about this?" Samantha shook her head, biting her lip. "No, I couldn't. I didn't want to worry them, especially with my brother. But now I'm not sure what to do. I don't want to put them in more danger." Ms. Carter nodded, understanding the difficult position Samantha was in. "I get it, but they need to know at least some of what's going on, especially if these threats continue. And we need to document everything, every message, every phone call. It's important to have a record." Ms. Carter reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small notepad, handing it to Samantha. "Start writing everything down, even if it seems insignificant. And if you get another threatening message, screenshot it. We might need this evidence later on." Samantha took the notepad, her hands shaking slightly. "Do you think I should go to the police?" she asked, uncertainty lacing her voice. Ms. Carter hesitated, clearly weighing her words carefully. "That's a tough call. The police could help, but there's always the risk that they might not take it seriously, or worse, that someone on the inside could be involved. For now, let's gather as much evidence as we can and see how things unfold." The conversation shifted as Ms. Carter pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts. I know some people in the media who might be able to help get this story out on a bigger scale. If we can draw enough attention, it might make it harder for Thorne to retaliate without facing public scrutiny. But Samantha, she paused, looking her directly in the eyes. This could get more dangerous before it gets better. Are you sure you're ready for that? Samantha swallowed hard, the gravity of the situation pressing down on her. But as scared as she was, she knew she couldn't back down now. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady with newfound resolve. With Ms. Carter's help, Samantha and Eric continued their work, each new piece of evidence adding weight to the story they were building. The blog post grew bolder, laying bare Thorne's corruption in a way that was impossible to ignore. The town was buzzing with rumors, and Thorne's carefully crafted image was beginning to crumble. But with every victory, the threats became more intense. Samantha couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that Thorne's reach extended further than she could imagine. She started looking over her shoulder wherever she went, her paranoia growing by the day. Ms. Carter was a rock for Samantha during this time, her experience as a former journalist proving invaluable. She helped them navigate the treacherous waters of whistleblowing, offering advice and support at every turn. But even she couldn't quell the gnawing fear that things were spiraling out of control. The pressure was building, and Samantha knew that they were approaching a breaking point. The question wasn't if Thorne would retaliate, but when and how much damage he would do when he did. Samantha was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. Her heart leaped into her throat as she sat up, her mind still groggy with sleep. The noise had come from outside, and as she rubbed the sleep from her eyes, she noticed the faint glow of headlights outside her bedroom window. She rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. Her family's car, parked in the driveway, was barely visible under the dim porch light. But something was wrong. The headlights weren't from their car. They belonged to another vehicle, speeding away into the night. By the time she made it downstairs, her parents were already outside. The air was thick with tension as they stood frozen, staring at the car. The windshield had been shattered, shards of glass glittering like ice on the driveway. But what made Samantha's blood run cold was the message scrawled across the side of the car in deep, jagged scratches. Stop or else. The words were crude, hastily etched, but the threat was unmistakable. Her mother, pale and shaking, clutched her father's arm as they took in the damage. Samantha's stomach churned with guilt and fear. She knew exactly who was behind this, but the last thing she could do was tell her parents the truth. Her father's voice cut through the night, trembling with anger. Who would do this? What kind of person? He trailed off, shaking his head as if trying to clear the thoughts racing through his mind. Her mother pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed the police. Samantha stood there, the cold night air biting at her skin, feeling utterly powerless. She wanted to scream, to cry, to tell her parents everything, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain that this was her fault, that her fight against Thorne had brought danger to their doorstep? Instead, she stayed silent, her heart pounding with fear and regret. The police arrived quickly, their flashing lights casting eerie shadows across the lawn. The officers took pictures, asked questions, and scribbled notes in their notepads. But Samantha could see the futility in their actions. Without any clear evidence or witnesses, there was little they could do. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with a sympathetic look in his eyes, told her parents that they'd increase patrols in the neighborhood, but Samantha knew it was more of a comfort gesture than anything effective. As the officers left, her mother pulled her aside, her voice trembling with concern. Samantha, are you sure there's nothing going on that we should know about? She asked, searching her daughter's face for answers. Samantha hesitated, the urge to confess bubbling up inside her. She could see the worry in her mother's eyes, the desperation to understand what had brought this threat to their family. But then she thought of the messages, the picture of Ethan, and the fear that had taken root in her heart. No, Mom, she lied, her voice barely audible. I don't know why anyone would do this." The lie felt heavy on her tongue, but she couldn't bring herself to put them in more danger by telling the truth. Her mother studied her for a moment longer before sighing, defeated. "All right, sweetheart, but if you think of anything at all, you need to tell us, okay?" Samantha nodded, but inside she felt like she was sinking deeper into a hole she couldn't escape from. The next morning, the news about the blog had spread even further, gaining national attention. Articles were popping up online, discussing the mysterious whistleblower who was taking on Gregory Thorne. The pressure was mounting on the mayor, and his public appearances were becoming more scarce, his usual charisma replaced by a nervous edge. But for Samantha, each new article, each shared post, felt like another step closer to disaster. The vandalism had been a clear message, a sign that Thorne was growing desperate. He was willing to go to any lengths to stop the leaks, and Samantha feared what he might do next. Eric's call came later that day. His voice was tense, but there was an underlying current of excitement. "Sam, we need to talk. The blog is blowing up. People are finally seeing Thorne for what he is. But listen, I've been thinking, maybe we should go public with our identities." The suggestion hit Samantha like a punch to the gut. "Go public? Eric, that's insane. You saw what they did to my car. What if they come after us directly?" she argued, her voice rising with panic. Eric hesitated, then pressed on. "I know it's risky, but think about it. If we go public, it might protect us. Thorne wouldn't be able to touch us without drawing even more attention. Right now, we're just shadows to him. If we show our faces, we could turn the tide." Samantha was torn. Eric's logic made sense. If they went public, it could make it harder for Thorne to act against them without facing backlash. But the thought of putting themselves out there, of exposing themselves to the full wrath of Thorne's desperation, terrified her. "I don't know, Eric. I'm scared. What if it just makes things worse?" she whispered, her mind reeling with the possibilities. Eric's voice softened, understanding the weight of her decision. "I'm scared too, Sam. But we're in this together, and whatever you decide, I'll back you up. Just think about it, okay?" Samantha nodded, though her heart was heavy with the realization that no matter what they did next, the danger was far from over. Samantha was still reeling from the vandalism when the next strike came. It was a sunny afternoon, and the air had that crisp, early autumn feel. She was walking home from school, lost in her thoughts, when she heard the screech of tires. Her head snapped up just in time to see her younger brother Danny on his bike crossing the street. Out of nowhere, a black car came barreling down the road, accelerating instead of slowing down. Time seemed to stretch painfully as Samantha screamed, her legs moving before she could think. But by the time she reached the edge of the street, the car had already swerved at the last moment, narrowly missing Danny before speeding off. Danny wobbled on his bike, his face white with shock as he toppled over onto the sidewalk. Samantha was at his side in an instant, her hands shaking as she helped him up. "Are you okay? Danny, are you hurt?" Her voice was frantic, her eyes wide with terror as she looked him over for injuries. Danny's lip trembled, but he shook his head. "I'm okay, I think. Just scared." Tears welled up in Samantha's eyes as she pulled him into a tight hug, her heart hammering against her chest. It wasn't an accident. She knew that with every fiber of her being. This was a message, a warning that Thorne was getting more desperate and more dangerous. By the time they got home, Samantha was barely holding it together. She guided Danny inside, forcing a smile as she reassured him it was just a reckless driver, nothing more. But inside, she was a storm of fear and guilt. Her parents noticed the tension the moment they walked through the door. Her mother's eyes narrowed with concern as she took in the paleness of Samantha's face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice tight. Samantha opened her mouth to brush it off, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't keep lying, not after what had just happened. Her brother had nearly been killed because of her secrets. Samantha's legs felt like they were made of lead as she sank onto the couch, Danny huddling close beside her. Her parents sat across from her, their expressions a mix of worry and confusion. Taking a deep breath, Samantha began to explain everything. The blog, the evidence against Thorne, the threats, and the car that nearly hit Danny. As the words tumbled out, her parents' faces shifted from shock to anger to fear. Her mother, normally so composed, was trembling by the time Samantha finished. "Why didn't you tell us sooner?" she demanded, her voice cracking with emotion. "We could have helped, protected you. I didn't want to put you in danger," Samantha replied, her voice small, barely holding back tears. Her father, who had been silent throughout, ran a hand over his face, struggling to process everything. "This is serious, Sam. This isn't just some school project. This is your life. Our lives." Samantha nodded, the weight of her actions pressing down on her. "I know, I'm so sorry. I didn't know what else to do." Her mother took a deep breath, trying to regain control. "We're going to fix this," she said firmly. "But first, I'm going to talk to my boss. I need to know why those documents were so easily accessible in the first place." The tension in the house was suffocating as her mother left to confront her boss. Samantha's father sat with her and Danny, trying to offer comfort, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Meanwhile, Samantha's phone buzzed with a message from Ms. Carter. "We need to act fast. I think it's time to release everything at once. Blow this wide open." Samantha stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Ms. Carter was right. They couldn't afford to drag this out any longer. Thorne was becoming more dangerous by the day, and the only way to stop him was to expose everything all at once, in a way he couldn't silence. That evening, Samantha and Eric met at her house, the mood somber but focused. The final batch of evidence was the most damning yet. Bank records, emails, and contracts that tied Thorne directly to organized crime. The sheer volume of it was overwhelming, and they knew that releasing it all at once would create a media frenzy too big for Thorne to control. "This is it," Eric said quietly as they sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents. "Once we hit publish, there's no going back." Samantha nodded, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She felt a mix of fear and resolve, knowing that this was their last shot to take Thorne down. As they prepared the post, the tension in the house was palpable. Her father paced the living room, his phone in hand, while her mother had yet to return from her confrontation at the law firm. Danny was upstairs, under strict instructions to stay away from the windows. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety, each minute dragging by as they finalized the details. Samantha's hands shook as she typed, her thoughts racing. This was it, the moment that could either save them or bring everything crashing down. Finally, with a deep breath, she and Eric hit publish, sending the final post out into the world. The instant the post went live, there was a collective exhale, but the tension didn't ease. If anything, it grew sharper, like the air before a storm. Samantha knew they had done the right thing, but the fear of what might come next gnawed at her. She glanced at Eric, who gave her a small, reassuring nod, but even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes. The house was quiet, too quiet, as they waited for the inevitable fallout, each tick of the clock sounding like a countdown to whatever Thorne would do next. The morning the final post went live, Samantha could barely breathe. The weight of what she and Eric had done settled over her like a heavy fog as she stared at the screen, the evidence now out in the world for everyone to see. The documents they had published were damning, far beyond anything they had revealed before. This time, they had exposed Thorne's darkest secrets, including proof of his direct involvement in the disappearance of a whistleblower who had tried to bring him down years ago. The enormity of it all was overwhelming. The blog post spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of fury and disbelief throughout the town and beyond. As the day wore on, the phone started ringing off the hook. Reporters from every major network were calling, desperate for interviews, for any scrap of information they could get. The media frenzy was unlike anything Samantha had ever seen, and the small town quickly found itself thrust into the national spotlight. Thorne's name was on everyone's lips, but this time it was accompanied by words like criminal, corruption, and cover-up. Samantha watched the news reports with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. The world was finally seeing Thorne for who he really was, but she knew this was only the beginning of a much larger battle. Meanwhile, Thorne's political allies began to distance themselves, scrambling to protect their own reputations as the scandal grew. Statements were released, full of carefully worded denials and vague condemnations, but it was clear that the walls were closing in on Thorne. Samantha and Eric exchanged a look of grim determination. They had done everything they could. Now it was up to the public, the media, and the authorities to take it from here. But even as they watched Thorne's empire begin to crumble, a deep sense of unease gnawed at Samantha. She knew Thorne well enough to know he wouldn't go down without a fight. That afternoon, Thorne held a press conference, his face as composed as ever, though there was a slight edge to his voice that hadn't been there before. He stood at the podium, flanked by American flags, and launched into a carefully crafted statement. "These allegations are completely false," he declared, his voice steady, but with an undercurrent of anger. "This is nothing more than a smear campaign orchestrated by my political enemies, desperate to discredit me before the upcoming election." His words were calculated, designed to sow doubt and shift the narrative. "I will not be intimidated by these baseless accusations. I have served this town with integrity, and I will continue to do so." Samantha watched the press conference in disbelief, her hands clenching into fists as Thorne twisted the truth, trying to paint himself as the victim. She could see the reporters in the crowd exchanging skeptical glances, but Thorne was relentless. He spoke with the confidence of a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. And maybe he could. Thorne had a way of making people believe him, even in the face of overwhelming evidence. But this time, Samantha knew the truth was too big to be ignored. She just hoped the rest of the world would see it too. As the press conference ended, Samantha turned to Eric, her mind racing. "We can't let him get away with this. People need to know the truth, the whole truth." Eric nodded, his expression hardening. "We've done our part, Sam. Now it's up to the media, the investigators, but we need to stay vigilant. Thorne's not done with us yet." The thought sent a shiver down her spine. She had hoped that once they released everything, the danger would pass. But it was clear now that Thorne was more dangerous than ever. His denial was a warning. He wasn't going to go quietly. The tension in the days that followed was unbearable. The house was filled with an anxious energy as Samantha's family tried to carry on with their lives, despite the chaos swirling around them. Her mother was constantly on the phone, talking to lawyers and journalists, while her father kept a watchful eye on the street outside, his worry growing with each passing day. Samantha could feel the strain in every conversation, every glance. They were all waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Thorne to make his next move. And they knew, deep down, that when he did, it would be devastating. As the media continued to dig into Thorne's past, more and more disturbing details began to surface. But for Samantha and Eric, the victory felt hollow. The fear that had been their constant companion refused to fade. Thorne was still out there, still a threat. And every time the phone rang or a car passed by too slowly, their hearts raced with dread. They had struck a blow against a powerful man, but in doing so, they had made themselves his primary targets. And as much as they tried to stay brave, the reality of their situation was impossible to ignore. Thorne wasn't finished with them, not by a long shot. Samantha had never felt terror like this before. The morning had started off normally enough, quiet and tense, like every day since the final post went live. But that calm was shattered when she turned the corner on her way home from school and saw Gregory Thorne standing by her front door. He was alone, dressed in a tailored suit that looked out of place in their suburban neighborhood. The sight of him there, just feet away from her home, sent a jolt of fear through her. Her steps faltered, and for a moment she considered turning around and running. But before she could decide, Thorne spotted her. He smiled, but there was nothing friendly in it. It was the smile of a predator, cold and calculating. "Samantha," he called out, his voice smooth, dripping with false warmth. "We need to talk." She could barely breathe as she approached him, her mind racing with thoughts of what he might do. Thorne kept his distance, but his presence alone was suffocating. "I've been very patient," he said, his tone shifting from friendly to menacing in an instant. "But now my patience has run out." Samantha's mouth was dry, her hands trembling as she tried to summon the courage to speak. "You need to leave," she managed to say, though her voice wavered. Thorne chuckled, a sound that sent chills down her spine. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere until we come to an understanding." He leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You're going to retract everything. Go public and admit that you made it all up. If you don't, your family, well, let's just say they won't be safe anymore." His words were like a punch to the gut. Samantha felt the blood drain from her face as the full weight of his threat settled over her. "You can't," she started, but Thorne cut her off, his voice low and dangerous. "I can, and I will. You have 24 hours to make your decision. After that, I won't be so forgiving." He stepped back, giving her one last look that conveyed the seriousness of his threat, before turning and walking away, leaving Samantha standing there, her world crumbling around her. As soon as Thorne was out of sight, Samantha rushed inside, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She collapsed onto the couch, gasping for breath, trying to steady herself. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear and desperation. Thorne's threat was real, and she knew he was capable of carrying it out. She couldn't let him hurt her family, but the thought of retracting everything, of betraying all the people counting on her to stand up to him, was unbearable. In her panic, one name came to mind: David Riley, the investigative journalist who had been following her story closely. He was well known for his fearless reporting and had a reputation for taking down powerful figures who thought they were untouchable. If anyone could help her now, it was him. With trembling hands, Samantha picked up her phone and found his number in her messages. They had spoken briefly before, but now she needed more than just a conversation. She needed his protection, his platform, and his reach. She dialed the number, her heart pounding as she waited for him to pick up. When his voice came through the line, calm and professional, it was like a lifeline. "Mr. Riley, it's Samantha." "Samantha Lewis," she said, her voice shaking. "I need to meet with you. It's urgent." There was a pause, and then Riley's voice softened. "Samantha, are you okay? What's going on?" She could barely keep her composure as she explained Thorne's visit and the ultimatum he had given her. Riley listened intently, and when she finished, he didn't hesitate. "Meet me at the diner on Elm Street in an hour. Bring everything you have. We'll make sure Thorne doesn't get away with this." The hour that followed was a blur. Samantha gathered all the documents, all the evidence they had on Thorne, and stuffed it into a backpack. She couldn't bring herself to tell her parents what was happening. Not yet. The fear of Thorne's retribution, if they found out, was too great. She slipped out of the house quietly, her heart pounding with every step, and made her way to the diner. When she arrived, Riley was already there, sitting in a booth at the back, his face serious but reassuring. She slid into the seat across from him, her hands clutching the backpack tightly. "I have everything here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thorne is threatening my family. He's going to do something terrible if I don't retract the story." Riley leaned forward, his expression hardening with resolve. "We're going to make sure the truth gets out, Samantha. Once this is published, there'll be too many eyes on him for Thorne to act without exposing himself further." Samantha nodded, trying to hold on to the hope that Riley's plan would work. As they went over the details one last time, the weight of her decision settled over her. She was putting everything on the line, her safety, her family, her future, in the hands of this journalist and the power of the truth. All she could do now was hope that it would be enough to stop Thorne, and that she hadn't already set events in motion that couldn't be undone. The morning the expose went live, Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her stomach in knots. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy with anticipation. Her parents were in the living room, their faces drawn with worry, while Danny was upstairs, trying to distract himself with video games. The article, written by David Riley, was already making waves across the internet, with headlines screaming, "Thorne's guilt" in bold letters. Samantha stared at her phone, refreshing the news sites every few seconds, waiting for the inevitable fallout. It didn't take long. Within hours, the story had gone viral, sparking outrage and disbelief across the nation. Thorne's crimes were laid bare for the world to see. His corruption, his connections to organized crime, and most damning of all, his role in the disappearance of a whistleblower years ago. The reaction was immediate and fierce. Calls for his arrest echoed across social media, and within hours, law enforcement was forced to act. Thorne, once the untouchable mayor with aspirations of higher office, was now a pariah, his career in tatters. Samantha's phone buzzed with messages of support from friends, classmates, and even strangers who had followed her story. But amidst the flood of praise, there was also an undercurrent of fear. The threats that had loomed over her for so long hadn't just vanished. Thorne was still out there, and until he was behind bars, she knew she couldn't truly relax. Her family had been placed under police protection, officers stationed outside their home to guard against any retaliation. But even with the added security, the tension in the air was palpable, every creak of the floorboards or ring of the phone setting Samantha's nerves on edge. The news broke that afternoon. Thorne had been arrested. The footage of him being led away in handcuffs, his face a mask of fury and disbelief, was broadcast on every major network. Samantha watched it on the living room TV, her parents on either side of her. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe, a flood of emotions crashing over her. Relief, exhaustion, and a deep, lingering sadness for everything they had lost. Her mother wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "It's over, Sam," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "He can't hurt us anymore." But as much as she wanted to believe it, Samantha knew the ordeal had left scars that wouldn't fade easily. The weeks of living in fear, the strain of keeping such a dangerous secret, had taken a toll on all of them. Her father had aged visibly in those days, his face etched with lines of worry. Danny, who had always been carefree and full of energy, was quieter now, sticking close to home, wary of the outside world. Samantha herself felt older, as if she had lived a lifetime in just a few short weeks. In the days that followed, the media attention shifted from Thorne to Samantha. Her story became a symbol of courage and the power of youth activism. Reporters wanted interviews, community leaders wanted her to speak at events, and her inbox was flooded with messages from people inspired by her bravery. But despite the praise, Samantha couldn't help but reflect on the cost of what she had done. The truth had come out, but it had nearly torn her family apart in the process. She had exposed a powerful man, but at the expense of her own sense of safety and innocence. One evening, a few days after Thorne's arrest, Ms. Carter came by the house. She had been one of Samantha's biggest supporters throughout the ordeal, and now she sat with her in the quiet of the living room, sipping tea and talking about everything that had happened. "You did something incredible, Samantha," Ms. Carter said softly, her eyes full of pride. "You stood up for what was right, even when it was terrifying. That's not something many people can say." Samantha nodded, staring down at her cup. I didn't know it would be this hard," she admitted. "I thought once the truth was out, everything would be okay. But it's not, is it?" Ms. Carter reached out, covering Samantha's hand with her own. "No, it's not," she agreed. "Doing the right thing often comes with a cost. But you made a difference, Sam. You showed everyone that one person can stand up to corruption, that truth and integrity still matter." Samantha looked up, meeting her teacher's gaze. "I just hope it was worth it," she whispered. Ms. Carter smiled gently. "It was. And because of you, people like Thorne will think twice before abusing their power." As the weeks passed, life slowly began to return to a new kind of normal. The police protection was eventually lifted, and the media frenzy died down, leaving Samantha and her family to pick up the pieces. It wasn't easy, but there was a sense of hope in the air, hope that they could move on from this, stronger and wiser. Samantha knew her life would never be the same, but she was beginning to accept that. She had faced something unimaginable and come out the other side not unscathed, but still standing. Looking back, Samantha realized that while she had lost some things along the way, her sense of safety, her trust in the world's fairness, she had also gained something far more valuable. She had discovered her own strength, her ability to fight for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. And as she looked toward the future, she felt a quiet pride in what she had accomplished, and a determination to continue standing up for truth, no matter the risks. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel. Now, how about another one? To watch another nice story, just click on the video appearing on your screen.